listening to My Bookcase Slays, a podcast where we discuss killer reads with the people who create them. And today I'm very happy to introduce my guest, Aaron Phillip Clark, the author of this new book, The Bluest Night. Welcome to the show, Aaron.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Aaron, this is the third installment in this series, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, third installment in the Detective Trevor Finnegan series. Yeah.
Trevor Finnegan, just for readers to have a reference point, he is a former cop, now a PI, living in the Los Angeles area. You write about this setting so vividly, and we're going to talk about that in a moment too. But give us a little bit of backstory on this series and what inspired it.
The first book, Under Color of Law, came out in 2021, and it was heavily inspired by my time in the Los Angeles Police Department training academy. I have police who are family members. I come from a line of officers. It was something that I was always interested in, so I went into the academy. Fortunately, I ended up getting injured, and it was rather short-lived, and I luckily was able to go back to teaching. And it took me a long time to want to write about that experience. And then one day I just sat down and I wrote 2 lines, and then I wrote a little more, and then before I knew it, I was like, oh, I actually have a lot to say about this whole thing. And so that's how Trevor Finnegan was birthed. You know, I thought about kind of a detective who has to play the game. And in that first book, he's not a hero. He is very much struggling, and he's trying to be better, but he's working within a system, and he's kind of put himself in as a kind of a part of the system, and he's a part of it, not the greatest part. It's the part where it's a lot of quid pro quo, a lot of I scratch your back, you scratch mine kind of things. And that's how he kind of excels and becomes detective. At the end of Under Color of Law, for those who have read it, those who haven't, no spoilers, but he is no longer able to be a police officer. So he finds himself becoming a private investigator. That kicks off book 2, Blue Like Me. And then that brings us into book 3, The Bluest Night. So he's a private investigator. He has a fledgling firm. He's just kind of putting it together. And he finds himself having to get involved in a case that's very close to home when his newly discovered stepbrother goes missing with his girlfriend in the Malibu area. And ultimately she's found dead, and his stepbrother is found battered and unable to remember much of the last few days.
And you complicate an already very tense and complicated story by presenting Trevor with a troubled relationship with his dad, who rides shotgun through a good part of the story. Can you talk about what inspired you to bring in that character so intimately into this particular book?
Yeah, so his father, Sean Finnegan, was introduced in the first book, but in that book, he is a little bit on the periphery. He acts as a sounding board for Trevor. He also acts as a antagonist for Trevor because he puts a lot of stress on Trevor. And even though they have a very interesting relationship in the sense of growing up, there was a lot of conflict there after Trevor's mother died. And he blames his father for a great deal. And his father is also alcoholic. I wanted to explore that relationship deeper in every book. And I knew that at some point there would be some sort of team up, some sort of buddy cop, team up. And it just seemed like it was perfect for this story, especially because his stepbrother Avery was on his way to see his father. So his father is very invested and has been communicating with Avery over the past few years and has a lot of guilt and regret about how he wasn't there for him. And really kept that whole kind of thing secret from Trevor and his mother. So, he's enmeshed in the story. And so in some ways, he's leading Trevor and the outstart of it because he's so determined to figure out what happened. And Trevor is the one who's kind of posing these questions of like, well, we don't really know this guy. What if, he's not who you think he is? And what if he really did do something to his girlfriend? And, Sean Finnegan, Pop, doesn't want to hear anything like that. He wants nothing, nothing of it. He's convinced that no child of his could commit such an act, such a heinous act.
And it indeed is a heinous act. I mean, there is a lot of gritty violence, very well described in this book. And I'm going to warn readers, you buckle up because you're in for a ride. I want to talk for a moment about your writing style. It is full throttle. I felt like I was reading like a Miami Vice or Mission Impossible, the way just the tension and the action just kept building. But can you talk about what your writing style came out of, or are you imagining the screenplay as you write this, because it was so visual?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I started as a screenwriter. After my undergrad, I thought that's what I was going to do. I thought I would write for film and TV until I realized that it's very difficult. And, when you're writing screenplays, it's so dependent. It's a blueprint, and it's so dependent on the right director, the right producer, the right cast. All those things have to come together. And so I became very disillusioned. And so I decided that I would explore fiction. I always was writing stories. I always wrote fiction. I just never thought that I was writing the types of stories that necessarily would get published. I was writing a lot of existential detectives. But I realized, you know what, I enjoy this. Why not go for it? The job market was awful. So I said, why don't I just go to grad school? And so I got my MFA in fiction, and that's where I really was able to explore all different genres. And I think that that's where my style came from. We had to read a book a week in my seminar class, and we read all types of novels, short stories, anthologies, everything we can get our hands on. So it was a really diverse class in terms of the reading list. And it just opened my eyes to so many different genres, but also styles in terms of how authors even and in craft, just how in terms they approach the work. I think my style became an amalgamation of all those things that I read in grad school, and I thought, well, this is a really fun thing that they do on this kind of literary side. What if I applied that to crime fiction and took that kind of approach? And to me, it's a mashup. It's kind of like, very classic style of writing that you might find in crime fiction, but at the same time, I like to say that I'm kind of tapping into the zeitgeist. I'm writing about things that are very topical, and things that sometimes might be explored in literature, or what we call, I think it's all literature, but when we talk about these distinctions, it's like it's more for the publishers so they can sell books. But I think it's all the same. But
yeah,
I
it's
guess more on the
genre
literary
of
side.
fiction, but the emotional depth, the characters' internal tragedy, the violence, the plot, it's all there. But then the characters are not light and stereotypical. Every single one gets very well developed and described and has their own burden and their own baggage that they're carrying through. Even the people who are off page. As I recommend this to people, I'm telling them this is exceptionally well written. Like it's a lot.
Thank you.
It's very well written. If you
I
were to have
appreciate that.
Oh, you're welcome. If you were to have your fantasy cast, let's dip in that pool for a moment. Who plays Trevor Finnegan? Because I have ideas about it, but I'd like to hear what you think.
This is interesting. So I've had different kind of actors in mind, but I do really like Kelvin Harrison Jr. And he's not like incredibly well known actor. He's done a lot of independent films and things like that, but he has the sensibility, I think, that would work with Trevor. And then for pop, I'm a huge fan of Roger Guinevere Smith. He's one of my favorite actors, and I think he would absolutely nail the role of.
You have some very distinctive secondary characters. Sandra and I forget the name of her sidekick, her Igor.
Nigel, yes.
Nigel. And oh, you name him Nigel, which is just so like, of course, that's the name of your butler, right? That had to have been one of the most fascinating characters I've run across in fiction in a long, long time. Talk about what made you develop Nigel in such a way.
There's an interesting style here in Southern California. And so one of those is that there, people who are very, I would say, serious about things like veganism, serious about the environment. There you would expect those people to almost to be hippie-like and some of them to be very, we love everything and treat everyone great. But there's actually almost like a very sinister element to it, where sometimes I would encounter people who were so staunchly, vegan that they almost would treat you with so much hostility. So Nigel kind of came out of that. He came out of this. That's how I envisioned him. And I saw him as this guy who's wearing these almost handmade frocks, and he walks barefoot. And you would look at him and think, this guy wouldn't hurt anything. But at the same time, yes, he's very gentle when it comes to nature. And, he's very gentle when it comes to insects, and he respects nature. But when it comes to human beings, is not so much. And, I think it's so noir to play against type, and you see one thing, but it's actually something completely different. And it's the idea that Nigel is you look at this peace loving guy who doesn't want to be seen driving the gas guzzling vintage BMW because his tree hugger friends will judge him.
Yeah, his character was a constant surprise.
Thank you.
made it very fun to read. Southern California. It's not my neck of the woods, obviously, coming with a Wisconsin accent here on the podcast. Everybody's like, yes, you are not from that part of the world, but you write about it so that I feel like I know it. Is this your native area? And talk about what informs your depiction of it.
Yeah, so I grew up in Los Angeles County. So, with a brief time, we had moved to the East Coast. I spent some time in the Southeast as well, and I went to school in Philadelphia. So, I have kind of experienced different parts of the country. And there's something about Southern California that when I sit down to write, it's what kind of bubbles to the surface. And I think it's because, growing up, California, it's funny when you grow up in a place and you leave, that place now exists in your memory. When I sit down and write, I go to a place of nostalgia very often. And that's kind of where my California lives. It's not quite how things are now, but it's almost like a version of it that is rooted in my memory. When I think about Trevor and I think about how he grew up, being a 90s kid, and I was a 90s kid, and kind of the exposure and how LA was then, which how it would inform how he approaches the city now. That becomes so much of his personality, right? When he has the conversation with Deputy Cohen, and Deputy Cohen is telling him, you would love kind of growing up here, but Trevor's like, I grew up in the valley. I don't. We were skateboarding empty swimming pools and things of that nature, and I couldn't imagine myself surfing, but you might have liked it here. I always like to show how all these different characters have a completely different experience with the city. So we get a lot of what Trevor remembers and how he grew up. But then we also see what it was like for Pop being a cop in the 80s, which was an incredibly violent time in the city. And so that's always fun to show how one place is completely different for different people. Be a paradise for some and a horrible place for others. I think that's always fun to write from those different points of view, and not idolize the city or romanticize it, but instead present it in a very, for me, to present it in a very realistic way. Just because it looks like a paradise doesn't mean that that's quite what it is for a lot of folks.
Exactly. And the racism that's brewing under the surface of such a beautiful place in Malibu plays a very central role in your story. And even Trevor, as respectable as he is in many ways, and he presents himself respectably, he's like hyper conscious of it as he moves through that community and finds himself just like iced out at different levels. And the extra effort that he has to take to conduct this investigation was really kind of horrifying to read in one way, but also I can imagine very realistic.
Yeah, the first book explored that deeply and really set the stage for it. That even though he has this badge, without the badge, he's subject to all sorts of horrific things that can kind of happen to him, and that the badge offered some sort of protection. Now that he no longer has the badge, he is in a far more vulnerable place. And he recognizes that in certain places he could be seen as a threat, and all it takes is one phone call and he could find himself in serious trouble. And essentially, as he's going through the investigation, if it wasn't for Deputy Cohen, he would find himself in a lot of trouble because he's an outsider in this community and he's on foot, which no one walks in. LA, so he's walking on foot. Even though he's dressed quite nice and things like that, he still is an outsider. He still stands out. And people call and then they say, hey, there's this guy walking around. It makes me uncomfortable, this, that, and the other. And so there's that underlining danger where it's not danger in the sense that in this book that someone's going to hop out and abduct Trevor or do something to him. But it's more of situational danger where all it takes is, someone in the community who's not even really integrated in the story doing something or saying something that now creates a new problem for Trevor. And it's the idea that there's conflict all around him. Just existing for him is having to navigate conflict in a place that's incredibly homogenous, in a place that is known as there's elements of Malibu that are tourist friendly, we'll just say. But once you're kind of off that beaten path and you find yourself in these kind of hidden communities that exist within the canyons and things like that, and they're gated, and that's when you would potentially encounter issues, right? People didn't recognize you or you weren't quickly identifiable.
It was so interesting to think of a place that has so many gates and so many barriers in between communities to separate people. And it's kind of promoted as, oh, this will keep you safe. But in many ways, those gates and those barriers make the world a more dangerous place.
Yeah. I think that that's a very Southern California thing. We have a lot of gated communities. And the idea, some of these communities have their own schools. They just
Yeah,
exist
I
behind the
was
gates.
just
Some have their
amazed.
own grocery stores.
Yeah, that's so crazy to think about
Yeah.
a place that is so locked off from the rest of the world around it.
Yeah, I mean, that's why they call it that area of Malibu Hidden Hills, because there's communities that are hidden literally from kind of the outside world. And it's this idea that the outside world is incredibly dangerous. And so what we can't control is what's within these gates. And what's scary is you don't know who's in those gates with you.
Right?
And
And how
so,
well that
yeah,
evil gets protected because it's inside of those gates.
exactly. And so just because on the surface, again, it looks a certain way, you have no clue who you're really living next to and what they're capable of and what they're doing in their basements. It takes Trevor in this situation as an outsider who recognizes that there's danger everywhere. So Trevor sees crime as equal opportunity. There is no safe place. Like I put it in the book, as long as people are committing homicides, there's no paradise.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to find that in every single community. People are doing horrific things. They just are doing it in the dark. And it's easier for people to believe that their communities are safe and they can have their doors unlocked. But they never know what's really happening. And they don't know what their neighbors are up to. They only see what's presented. And there's a danger in that, going through the world with that naivete, believing that, my community is incredibly safe because we're all the same. We go to the same church. We pretty much, shop at the same stores. We go to the same restaurants. Such and such knows my family. Those very homogenous kind of places. They actually, I think, produce a more level of danger because people aren't looking for it.
There were a lot of unexpected twists as I was reading this book. As you were writing it, did anything come to you later, or was there anything that you had to axe as you were coming to the final drafts?
So I had taken a break. The last Blue Like Me, the second book, came out in 2022. And so I had taken a break. I had co-written the book, The Accomplice, with 50 Cent. And so I was working on that. And then I was writing this, The Bluest Night, at the same time, kind of toward the tail end of that. And then I also was writing a standalone. So it was one of those things where The Bluest Night, I was kind of just taking my time. And then there was a moment where I think I must have hit maybe page 100 or something like that. And I feel like that's always the tipping point in some way, because once you hit kind of page 100, everything flows after that. I remember because I said, oh, wow. And I just started outlining, and it all just kind of started coming to me. And I said, I got to go somewhere and actually finish this. Like, this is flowing out. And, it was around the holiday season and there was a lot going on. I was able to sneak away. And I go to this retreat, this artist retreat in Ojai, which is in Ventura County. It's in the mountains. Beautiful place. Johnny Cash used to live there. And they still have his house as this like a museum. But it's an artsy little place, artsy little community where you can kind of hide away. And so I go to this retreat. They have no television in there, really no electronics whatsoever. It has a small kitchen and you can stay inside for like days. And so I went there and I sat down and at the little table and chair sat in there and I just wrote. And I must have been writing nonstop, really. I slept and then got up and did it again, and probably for 3 days. And then the book was just about done. And I came home. I did some finishing touches on it, but no, I mean, really, what ended up on the page during those 3 days is really what stayed in the book. I went back and kind of amplified some things and made sure that there was things in there that connected to the other stories, because that was the hardest part. Really, was remembering what I had written before and making sure that like there was things in there that I made sure there was a through line and that character names were correct. So it's things like that. So I had to kind of go back and review and then make sure everything linked up. And then that was it. The book, it came together very quickly. I really thought it would be the last one, and Severn House said, "No, or are you interested in writing another one?" And so I said, "Yeah, I'll do one more, and then I think that'll be it. Just the 4 books, I think, is good."
So there's a fourth.
Yes, the fourth is called Blues for the Dead. It picks up a few years later, but
Okay.
it's essentially a little more solidified. He really is the case that emerges in this book that makes him semi-famous. So he's dealing with that, being a little more recognizable, and he finds himself in the crosshairs of a far more powerful antagonist than he's ever encountered. And it's a person who has quite a bit of power and can leverage technology and really disrupt Trevor's life in a way that so far no one else has been able to do.
Okay, sounds very intriguing. These are strong characters, and the way you write the plot and the action, I am interested. I'll be keeping an eye out for that one for sure. Aaron, can you tell us what you are recommending other people to read these days?
There's a few. So let's see. I am currently reading. Well, some of this is fiction, some of this is nonfiction. So nonfiction wise, I'm reading "A Little Devil in America" by Hannah Ardurakib. I think that's how you say his name. And it's just about the history of Black performance. And it was the National Book Award finalist. And I'm a huge fan of that. And then I'm also reading Walter Mosley's newest one, Grey Dawn. Almost just about done with that one. So it's the latest Easy Rollins.
And if you were to recommend a beverage with the Bluest Night as one is sitting around reading this, what would you say pairs nicely with your book?
Well, I'll recommend two. So if you want something in the morning and you're reading it, go with, I would say, like a tea latte, something like a London Fog or something like that.
Okay.
I think that would work. And then if you're reading this at night, I would say any cocktail, but I would recommend the dark and stormy. Little whiskey in there, little ginger beer, something you little spice there, something you can sip. Because while it does take place in Malibu and there's these beautiful views, a lot of that's where the title came from. So the idea that we have these beautiful sunsets here in LA, but the really nice ones are in Malibu. So you get about 8 to 10 minutes of just this beautiful cascade of colors, purples, reds. It's just awesome. But as soon as it gets dark, everything looks different and changes. And there are no lights up there. So it's just, if you're lucky, there's a full moon and you can see by moonlight. But other than that, it is pitch black and coyotes are coming out and all these night creatures are starting to come. And that's the idea. It's like when the moon does hit, it has this really interesting blue hue that kind of gets filtered through the clouds. And so I would say a drink that can that can pair well with that. I would say for folks who are into it, dark liquor. It's not a beer book, but you might need something strong with one of those nice circular ice cubes sitting in the tumbler. That's what I would say.
Duly noted. I'll pass that along to the next people I know reading this book. Oh, well, thank you so much for your time today, Aaron. I enjoyed listening to what you had to say about your work and this particular book. And I also want to extend thanks to the Authors on the Air Radio Network for helping produce this show.
Thank you.